The English writer Samuel Johnson famously said that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Now, Johnson was himself a British patriot. He was also kind of a London patriot. In fact, he said he who is tired of London is tired of life. But he loved his home country. In fact, part of his patriotism was to turn against the American Revolution, because he saw the American Revolution obviously as a rebellion against Great Britain. He referred to the American revolutionaries as, quote, a race of convicts. So here's Johnson, politically incorrect to the core. And even then, you can see how sensitive he was and how clever in touching upon some of the seeming anomalies or contradictions of the founding. He goes, why do we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of slaves? So Johnson, right there, this couldn't have been more timely. It could be said today. Now, what did Johnson mean by patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel? Well, what he meant was not that patriotism is bad. No. What he meant, rather, is that patriotism can become a big excuse for selfish people who want to do very bad things to do it in the name of patriotism. So the point being, it gives their low motives a camouflage. We're acting for the higher good, for the common good of society. So patriotism is invoked by cunning people who use it as a pretext for corruption and for the abuse of power. Now, all of this came to my mind when I read really a very trenchant article in the Wall Street Journal. It's by James Sensenbrenner, who you might remember is a former congressman. He served from Wisconsin from 1979 to 2021. This guy's spent, I'd say, half his life, if not more, in Congress. He was the primary drafter of the Patriot Act. And he says, listen, as the principal author of the Patriot Act and the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee that put that act into play, he goes, quote, the Biden administration's unparalleled effort to transform federal laws and agencies into instruments of domestic political repression. So Sensenbrenner is saying they are abusing the Patriot Act. They are abusing the law that I helped to pass. And he goes, listen, let's remember the Patriot Act was passed immediately following 9/11. He says the goal was really simple, to prevent additional foreign terrorist attacks on American soil, as well as foreign terrorists operating within America. And you do that by sharing and collecting intelligence information, restricting terrorist financing, and enhancing border security with regard to terrorism. That's the purpose. That's why the law was written. He says terrorism was clearly defined to mean, quote, mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. It was specified what terrorism is. And he goes, our laws and jurisprudence draw a clear distinction between acts of terrorism calculated to decimate a civilian population and the robust expression of views that sustain democratic self-government. I think what Sensenbrenner is outraged here is the way in which Merrick Garland, this Attorney General, intends to use the Patriot Act against who? Parents who are opposed to school boards, parents who are protesting, making their voices heard. He goes, quote, when debating the Patriot Act and other federal anti-terrorism laws, nobody in either chamber of Congress could have imagined these laws would be turned against concerned parents at local school board meetings. Now, this can be taken a couple of ways, but one way for me is to say, listen, this is the way in which when you give the government power, they always abuse it. They always extend it. They contort it to purposes for which it was not intended. And so in retrospect, if it were me, I would not vote for the Patriot Act now. Why? In the anticipation of the myriad ways in which these laws can be abused. And Sensenbrenner goes on to say, listen, these federal agencies have no authority, no jurisdiction to invoke federal anti-terrorism laws to chill protected speech and expressive conduct. He says this violates both the letter and the spirit of laws that were approved by bipartisan majorities. And he calls finally for this to be immediately withdrawn. So here's a guy, now I think in the later part of his life, issuing a kind of warning. And by the way, this is a common feature of when societies are pushing in a more tyrannical direction. There are people who sort of sound the alarm. They go, listen, this is not the America that we had in mind. This is not the purpose for which we passed these laws. And so even though you can say that the Patriot Act itself bears some responsibility, the main responsibility is obviously with the abusive people that are abusing the act. It's kind of like a domestic abuser who takes advantage of let's say, his domestic authority. The problem isn't with the domestic authority, it's with the abuse of authority by a guy who obviously has no regard for any norms of common decency. And I think we have to say of Merrick Garland and of Biden and the whole gang, they're a very indecent group of people. They're people who are unscrupulous in the pure meaning of the word. They have no scruples. They have no qualms. These aren't inept people. They are extremely bad, vicious people. And we've got to keep that in mind. And this is the kind of thing that, remember, pendulums of power do swing. These things should not go unpunished when Republicans have their own turn at power.